Hello everyone, my name is Sophia Serratos, and today I'll be presenting my research on the long-term effects of childhood emotional maltreatment, specifically on how emotional neglect during childhood influences depressive symptoms and academic engagement among college students ages 18 to 25. This topic is deeply relevant in psychological research because emotional maltreatment, especially neglect, is often invisible yet highly impactful. I also have personal motivation tied within my research based on my own experiences being a first-generation college student and being the oldest out of my 4 siblings. Okay, so emotional maltreatment includes experiences like lack of emotional support, invalidation, rejection, chronic emotional neglect, and unlike physical abuse, emotional neglect can be subtle but still shape a person's cognitive, emotional, and academic development, which can later stem larger issues in adulthood. My research question asks, how does emotional maltreatment during childhood influence depressive symptoms and academic engagement in college students ages 18 to 25? Based on the research, my hypothesis is that individuals who experience emotional maltreatment will report higher levels of depression and lower levels of academic engagement during early childhood. Okay, moving on. Okay, why this topic matters. This topic matters because emotional maltreatment is one of the most common forms of childhood adversity, yet is the least likely to be reported or recognized. College is a period of time where students face increased academic and social pressures, and unresolved emotional wounds often resurface during these times. Understanding how emotional neglect affects both mental and academic engagement can help universities better support students through counseling services, early intervention, and target programs and strengthen resilience within students. With my first study, it focuses on emotional clarity and how it affects depression. So the first study by Jessar and colleagues in 2017 found that emotional neglect in early adolescence reduces emotional clarity, which is the ability to understand and label one's own emotions. When emotional clarity is low, individuals struggle to regulate their mood and understand their inner self, which could lead to elevated depression symptoms. For college students, this might mean misinterpreting their own emotion responses, withdrawing socially, experiencing depressive episodes triggered by stress due to the workload and external factors. This study helps explain a part of the mechanisms linking childhood neglect and mental health struggles in adulthood. Moving on to my second study. This study goes over the coping and academic function. So the NYU Steinhardt article highlights how childhood maltreatment disrupts academic resilience. Students with a history of emotional neglect often experience lower motivation, reduced participation, and difficulty concentrating in the classroom. The 2024 study adds another layer, stating that neglect leads to avoiding coping strategies. Individuals may avoid stressful academic tasks, delay assignments, or isolate themselves, which is all leading causes of depression symptoms. Avoidant coping, in turn, heightens the depressive symptoms and reduces academic persistence. These findings emphasize how emotional neglect influences how students manage stress and how they perform academically. Okay, moving on to my other 3 studies. So these are 3 additional studies helped clarify the risk and protective pathways. So the Hartino study found that purpose in life can buffer the effects of emotional maltreatment. Students who feel a sense of direction and meaning report fewer less of depressive symptoms, even with a history of neglect. And then Keeley's study discovered that shame and narcissistic vulnerability act as mediators. Neglected children may grow up feeling unworthy or overly self-critical, which increases depression in adulthood. Finally, Madsen shows that emotional neglect can shape adults' attachment styles, which then heighten the stress and depressive symptoms. Insecure attachment can also undermine academic confidence and engagement. So, to wrap it all up, for an overview, major themes found across these studies. So across the 6 peer-reviewed studies I analyzed, several consistent themes that emerged was: first, emotional neglect strongly predicts depressive symptoms. Second, students with a history of maltreatment show lower academic resilience. Third, emotional clarity, coping strategies, shame, and attachment styles all serve as mediators between childhood experiences and adulthood outcomes. These themes shape my understanding of how early emotional deprivation influences functioning during college years, and could even go as far to say affecting the other important aspects of adulthood like careers, relationships, etc. Okay, so my hypothetical proposed method involves around 300 to 500 college students ages 18 to 25. Participants would complete a validated measure such as the childhood trauma questionnaire, the PHQ for depressive symptoms, and an academic engagement scale. I would analyze correlations and use regressions to examine how emotional maltreatment predicts depression and academic engagement. Additionally, mediation analysis would test whether factors like emotional clarity, coping styles, or attachment can explain these relationships. Okay, so this study uses secondary data analysis approach to examine the relationships between adverse childhood experiences and educational outcomes. Rather than collecting my own original data, I analyze these findings from existing peer-reviewed and large-scale data sets to investigate the adversity, mental health, and academic performance. To guide this analysis, I compared trends across studies focusing on dose-response relationships, meaning how increased numbers of ACEs are associated with progressively worse educational outcomes. I also examined stress-related cognitive impairments that help explain why ACEs impact learning and school success. Finally, these findings were synthesized to identify consistent patterns across the literature rather than relying on one single study. Okay, so my expected outcomes. Based on the research, I expect a higher emotional maltreatment scores would predict higher depressive symptoms and lower academic engagement. I also expect mediators like shame, emotional clarity, and coping to partially explain these outcomes. These findings would have important implications. Universities could incorporate emotional screening into counseling services to help students strengthen emotion regulation skills and implement academic support systems that acknowledge the impact of early trauma. And then, moving on to limitations, while these findings across these studies are compelling, it's important to acknowledge that there are several limitations. First, many studies rely on self-reported data, which can be influenced by memory errors, self-report bias, and reluctance to disclose sensitive experiences. Additionally, most of the research is correlational, meaning that while there is strong associations, it does not equal causation. ACEs are not measured the same in every single study, so differences in how adversity is defined, categorized, and affected in each individual can vary. Finally, many studies emphasize risk factors more than protective factors, such as supportive relationships, school interventions, and resilience-building programs, which may help mitigate negative outcomes. Despite these limitations, the consistency of results across diverse populations and research designs suggest that relationships between ACEs and educational achievement is both impactful and significant. Okay, to wrap everything up, the research really shows how impactful childhood emotional neglect can be, even years later during college. Although emotional neglect is often less visible than other forms of maltreatment, the literature suggests that it is a strong link to depressive symptoms, emotional dysregulation, and lower academic engagement in emerging adulthood. What is especially important is that emotional neglect doesn't just affect academic performance on its own, and instead it often works through depressive symptoms, which can make it harder for students to stay motivated, focused, and engaged in their coursework. This helps explain why some students may struggle academically even though they're capable and hardworking. The research also points to some hopeful takeaways, like factors like purpose in life, resilience, and supportive academic environments that can help reduce these negative effects of emotional neglect. This highlights why trauma-informed approaches in education are so important, whether it's through counseling services, mentorship, academic support programs that recognize students' emotional experiences. I think studies like this help bring awareness to such things, and overall, understanding how emotional neglect shapes mental health and academic engagement can help colleges better support students and create environments where they feel understood, supportive, and are able to exceed properly. Thank you.